Hi, I'm David Klimple, and this is a quick talk about dengue fever. So what we're going to do today is first give just a quick overview about dengue. Then we're going to have an interview from a patient with dengue. We're going to give a clinical presentation, some epidemiology, some virology, clinical trials, and then some quick do's and don'ts. Now a quick overview about dengue. It's a flavivirus spread by mosquitoes. It's located in Indonesia and Northeast Australia, South and Central America, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and some parts of the Caribbean. The symptoms are as follows: fever, rash, headache, muscle aches, nausea, swollen lymph nodes, and vomiting. And now an interview with a patient who had dengue fever. My name is David Klimple, and this is James Coulter, and we are here to give you a little clinical correlate about dengue fever. So James, I know that you went to Haiti last year, and you picked up something along the way that you weren't expecting to pick up. You mind just kind of giving me a little bit of background about kind of why you decided to go to Haiti in the first place?
So in December 2010, I went down to Haiti with two of my roommates, and we were pretty much going to an orphanage, 250 orphans, with the hopes of setting up a clinic in the future.
Hey, these are some of the kids here. There's about 240 here right now, 100 of which came in after the earthquake.
And had you done any research before you got there about the diseases that were endemic to Haiti, or did you have any concerns about possibly picking up any diseases when you were in a third world country?
So there is a battery of vaccinations that you're supposed to get. Pretty much includes your standard travelers vaccinations like hepatitis A, things of that nature. But and you also take malaria prophylaxis pills. So the biggest thing on our minds was probably the malaria. It was the biggest thing that we were concerned about catching. I think that we were aware that dengue was down there, but it definitely wasn't on our minds as far as something that we would catch, because we hadn't really heard much about people catching it other than what we had seen in our microbiology textbooks.
Right. So when you finally got down there, can you tell me a little bit about what you saw, what kind of things were going through your head when you were kind of looking around the area?
Yeah, absolutely. So we went down there. Actually, it was technically the dry season, but a hurricane had come through the country, I believe a month or two earlier, and it flooded the country pretty extensively. And at the place we were at, there were a couple of empty lots behind the orphanage that had been flooded pretty good, and there was some standing water. And this was all going on during the cholera epidemic. So one of the few things that was on our minds was malaria and also cholera. So when we were down there, we actually noticed that there was a lot more mosquitoes than what we were probably expecting to encounter.
So we're in Haiti right now, and there's a lot of mosquitoes. And
Big bugs.
there's really big bugs here. We got...
Is that a spider on the wall or is that a bullet hole?
But we kind of just sort of blew it off, just thinking that we were covered for malaria and we had pills in case we caught cholera, and that was pretty much all that we were really worried about. So getting bit by a mosquito a couple hundred times a day wasn't really bothering us, because we thought the chloroquine was going to protect us from what we thought we were going to catch.
And how were you protecting yourselves against the mosquitoes?
So it's pretty much like I mentioned earlier, we're just using chloroquine for malaria, and that was the extent of our coverage. I know that I was wearing jeans for a couple days as just to kind of cover my body up a little more from mosquitoes. But we weren't using any insect repellent.
Right. And I know that the orphanage has mosquito nets that they can provide for you while you sleep. Whether or not they work or not is another issue. Did you guys sleep under mosquito nets?
We actually did not sleep under mosquito nets, and which was something that we ended up doing later on future trips. But we also didn't have metal mesh screen on the window either to keep bugs out at night. So we had our window open with the flooded lot in back of our rooms,
Oh,
and the
no.
mosquitoes would come in at night, and it wasn't, for some reason, I think it was just our own arrogance, thinking that the chloroquine was the panacea, would
Right.
protect us.
So, and how wrong
How wrong
they
you,
were.
How wrong. How horribly wrong.
As this castle of cards came a-tumbling down. So how long were you there? What kind of things were you doing? Tell me a little bit about how you spent your days.
Absolutely. So we were down there for, I believe, about 5 days. And the whole idea was to go to this one town, just kind of figure out what the local population was like, what kind of diseases were we expecting to encounter, so we can figure out what kind of medications we needed to bring back with us for a future clinic. We visited the local hospital. We went to the cholera tents and saw the cholera epidemic face to face in the flesh. And it was a pretty intense experience. And that was pretty much the extent of that first visit. It was just a fact-finding mission to figure out what we needed to do for when we came back with other doctors.
Got it. So you saw cholera then?
Yes, we did see cholera.
We're here at the hospital in Hinch. It's pretty primitive by Western standards. There's not even running water here. Outside here, there are temporary cholera tents. There's been a recent epidemic. Right now, they're fairly full, though in the past they've been overflowing, and they actually had to move into the chapel here on the hospital campus.
See any dengue, or was there any talk about people who having dengue?
There actually was no talk of dengue. I think my roommate who came with me brought it up maybe once or twice because we had read about it being in the area, and the local inhabitants seemed to pretty much dismiss it and didn't think it was much of anything to worry about.
Right. And I know that, a year and a half out from microbiology, I remember that dengue is a flavivirus. I remember that it has hemorrhagic components, but besides that, really, is there anything that you kind of going into Haiti thought, oh, I know all about dengue. If I get it, I'll know what it is. I'll, remember it, and because it's hardly, it's something that you just don't see in the United States. It's not something that's on the forefront of your mind.
Absolutely. To be perfectly honest, I just really wasn't even thinking about dengue going into Haiti, and just wasn't even considering catching it until after I came back and became sick.
Right. So you came back, and then what?
So a couple days after we get back, I believe we got back on about a Wednesday, and I noticed around that Friday I was kind of just wasn't feeling really all that good. It's kind of felt like, I had like a rhinovirus or something going on, just kind of like a head cold.
Body aches.
There's some body aches. Yeah, just kind of like your generic little cold symptoms. It was December, or actually it was January at that point because we came back after New Year's. But, it was wintertime back home in the States. We just kind of figured, we were just traveling in an airport on an airplane.
Right.
We must have caught something on the airplane. It's a little cold virus or bug or something, and didn't really think much about it.
Were you the only one who had symptoms, or did everyone in your house get symptoms at the same time? You guys all sick together?
So 3 of us went down, and only 2 of us came back. Only 2 of us ended up showing any symptoms. The third roommate who came down with us actually wore long sleeve clothes throughout the entire trip and never caught dengue fever. So when I say wearing long sleeve clothes is the most important thing to do, is probably, just from what I've witnessed firsthand, is probably one of the best things you can do.
Just go in there looking like a beekeeper.
Pretty much. Beekeeper is the way to go.
Suit. Yeah, absolutely.
Saran wrap the entire body.
Including the mouth and nose. You can't be too careful.
You don't want them getting up there.
No. So during these first few days, when you were having body aches and just kind of feeling generally like garbage, did you have any fevers that you were spiking? Yeah.
So on Friday is when we started to get the cold symptoms, and I'd say maybe Friday night or Saturday we started spiking fevers around 103 to 104 degrees.
Wow. And at that point, was there any talk of seeking medical care or going to a doc in the box, going to a hospital?
No, honestly, at that point, I just figured it was either a cold virus or a flu virus, and that it would just burn itself out in a couple days. You know, being a med student, oddly kind of thought it was somewhat interesting having a fever and thinking about the whole febrile process, but it honestly wasn't a concern to me, and I just took some Tylenol and went to bed that night.
All right. And so now we're at the point where you feel horrible, you have body aches, your head is kind of fuzzy feeling, and you have a fever of around 104 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And this is about 4 or 5 days after you got back?
About, yeah.
All right. So then what happened within the next few days?
So in the next few days, the cold symptoms really weren't resolving. It kind of just turned into that generalized, achy, flu-like feeling. And with the fever, I thought it was pretty reasonable to think that I had the flu, and considering the time of year also. And my roommate began to go downhill quicker than I did. Let's say by the end of the weekend, he was feeling pretty lethargic and was kind of laying around the house, wasn't moving a whole lot, and that was about the initial course. He began to get worse first before I did.
Any other symptoms? Sore throat, runny nose, sneezing, coughing, diarrhea, vomiting, anything like that?
I don't really, in the beginning, I don't really recall any coughing. It was just kind of, it kind of started off as a dried out soft palate, kind of like a classic rhinovirus. Mm-hmm. Then you started to have the rhinorrhea, and a few days on, I noticed my roommate and myself began to notice that we started to develop really red skin. I at first attributed it to being the sunburn that I had in Haiti, and that it just looked a little more red because I was sick, and I thought that was contributing to it. But as the time went on, we kind of noticed that it was encompassing our whole body in areas that we weren't sunburned, and it became very itchy, almost like a painful athlete's foot rash. It was kind of what it felt like all over our bodies.
So was it red and blanching, like someone had just hit you, or was it like a kind of like vesicular, like a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction? Yeah. What did your skin look like?
Honestly, it looked like a pretty good sunburn. You go to the beach, you get like a nice red sunburn all over your body. But the thing I noticed about this is that I was red all over, and I had little islands of white, maybe about dime-sized little white spots all over my body, particularly around my trunk. And at first I thought it might be something like hives starting to develop, but they were pretty flat and never began to raise. It was just little islands of white in the sea of red.
And then what other symptoms started popping up, if any?
So as that progressed, I became very anorexic. I wasn't able to eat very much. A lot of body aches. As far as medications at the time, I was going back and forth between Motrin and Tylenol, switching off every 2 hours, and I'm sure my liver and kidneys were loving that.
Right.
And so I was using that for pain and fever management at the time. And along with the rash, I noticed that I was waking up in the morning with a lot of bloody snot.
Really? Okay. Still no thought at this point about going to the doctor?
At this point, I wasn't really sure what we were thinking. I think I was just so sick. I was just trying to ride it out. At this point, I don't know if dengue fever was really popping up in my mind. I thought that this still just might be a flu, just like a really bad flu that you catch like maybe once or twice in your life.
Wow.
But as far as, I think one of the worst things was just that having that anorexia. I was probably down to I was only able to keep down maybe 300 to 500 calories a day at best, and I absolutely had to force that down. It was pretty much Gatorade and Ensure.
Right,
wow. Was all I could keep
So you actually bought Ensure.
I bought Ensure like an old man.
How much weight did you end up losing throughout the entire course of this?
Honestly, I was lucky. I didn't lose too much weight. I maybe lost somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds over a couple weeks.
So you're losing weight, you hurt all over, you're waking up with blood coming out of your nose. At what point did you think that something might be wrong?
I thought something was wrong throughout the whole time. The question was what exactly was going on. I know my roommate, he was pretty much going through the same symptoms, but to a lesser degree, and he recovered quicker than I did. And I think before the trip, we used to joke around about one of us catching cholera, and we'd have to treat the other one. And then I think my roommate at the start kind of was joking around that it might be dengue fever, and he was actually the one kind of pushing the dengue hypothesis in the house to begin with.
Right. So what ended up bringing you to the doctor? What symptoms or what realization?
Okay, so for a few days out, I was pretty much bedridden, couldn't leave the house hardly, and I was just trying to get my appetite back up. Then after a few days, I was able to kind of tolerate some more food. The fever was kind of breaking. So at that point, I decided to leave my apartment at school and go back up to my parents' house to kind of recover for a few days where someone could cook for me and mother me, if you will.
Right.
Tell me it was going to be okay. So I just went back to my parents' house for a few days, and what happened that actually sent me to the doctor was the morning after at my parents' house, I woke up with petechiae on my palms and on the soles of my feet, and it was actually painful to walk around. And at that point, the rash was getting pretty bad, and it was all over my body, and the little islands of white and the sea of red were becoming very prominent. And at that point, I decided that with the petechiae that it was time to go see a doctor.
I bet. So you still having the fevers at this point?
At this point, I don't know if I'm having the fevers because I'm taking so much Motrin and Tylenol that I might just be quieting it down.
All right. So
I don't know if I would be having a fever.
You may or may not have a fever. You don't really know because of all the meds that you're taking.
Yeah.
You have a rash all over your body with superimposed petechiae in your hands and feet.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I also had pretty prominent inguinal lymphadenopathy as well.
All right, so you have everything.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
have the textbook illness at this point.
So then where did you go?
So I pretty much just went to a doc-in-the-box doctor.
And they were immediately able to diagnose you.
Because I'm still not taking it seriously, just because of my own arrogant attitude. No, I've actually, he's more than a doc-in-the-box doctor. I joke around about it. No, it was actually my primary care physician. I went and saw him. He saw the rash and knew that I had what he said was a systemic illness of some sort that he didn't know what it was.
And did he take any labs? Did he find anything that was elevated or suspicious looking?
He drew my blood and checked my liver enzymes, and I believe I had some elevated AST and ALTs. I can't remember which ones, which numbers corresponded to which one, but I think it was my.
Strangely, the AST was twice as high as the ALT.
Strangely enough, I was drinking throughout the whole process. No, actually, I think it was. I think my ALT was 300 something, and I think my AST was about 150, is what he told me when I called him. And then, so at that point, my roommate kept saying that, oh, it must be dengue fever. And so then at that point, I decided to just start doing some research of my own on dengue fever. And when I was looking online was when I found out about this very classic rash associated with dengue fever that isn't often taught at medical school. Was a sea of red with islands of white throughout. Usually it was sparing of the face. And the whole timeline fit pretty well. It was about maybe 4 or 5 days after coming back from Haiti. I started to show signs and symptoms of an illness. And then pretty much resolved in about 10 days from the onset, which is about what you would expect with dengue fever.
Let's see. So you were able to, I'm sorry, so after you got a diagnosis of some systemic infection with the elevated liver enzymes, and you gave yourself kind of an armchair diagnosis of dengue, then how did you proceed with your management?
So the management was pretty much reading online, finding out if there was a treatment for it, and there isn't. Currently is not a treatment for dengue fever, but
just says deal with it.
more or less, it was supportive care, and at that point, I was actually, despite the petechiae, I was feeling a lot better. I was regaining much of my appetite. I was able to, sit down and have dinner with the family, eat steak and potatoes at that point. So I was beyond ensuring Gatorade.
Great.
So I think that once the appetite started to come back was when I was pretty confident that I was starting to come out of the woods.
So now that you've had dengue fever, you've been exposed to the serotype that gave you all of your symptoms. Are you afraid about getting dengue again? Is it possible for you to get dengue again? Give me a little bit of immunology here.
Okay. As far as I understand it, that if you catch, there's 4 different serotypes, and if you catch one of the serotypes that you're immune to it, but there's also 3 other serotypes that you can be exposed to and in theory catch dengue fever again, and some hypothesize that if you catch it once and catch a different serotype that you're at higher risk for catching the hemorrhagic version of dengue fever.
Now, was your type the hemorrhagic type?
I don't know if it was hemorrhagic or not, but I definitely had a lot of bloody snot when I woke up in the morning. Wasn't like the Ebola virus with blood coming out of my eyes, but...
Oh, I forgot to mention, blood was coming out of my eyes.
Yeah.
I went to Haiti with your second trip there.
We're going to Haiti. So we're about to go to this village and deliver those cans to people who don't have any clean water.
Yeah.
And I know that I permethrined all of my clothes. I wore several layers. I slept under a mosquito net that may or may not have worked. So I appreciate you giving me the advice about dengue and malaria specifically. Do you have any closing remarks for prophylaxis against, or not prophylaxis, for prevention of dengue fever specifically?
Yeah. So with dengue fever, it's all about keeping the mosquitoes away. So that's going to include long sleeve clothes, bug spray that's at least 25% DEET. Beware of the mosquitoes in the early morning and early evening. Those are the ones that typically transmit the dengue virus. And just go ahead and sleep under a mosquito net at night. It can never hurt. And just be aware of your surroundings. And if you're noticing you're getting bit by mosquitoes, just go ahead and spray yourself down even more.
And light yourself on fire.
Lighting yourself on fire.
Mosquitoes will not bite you if you're on fire. This is also not in medical texts. But it's actually, it works. Thank you, James, for letting me interview you.
Thank you, David.
And thank you, John, for being behind the cameras. And that's it. All right. All right, so dengue fever is transmitted between people by mosquitoes that I'm not going to try to pronounce. The symptoms start around a week after the mosquito bites and typically last around a week. Clinical presentation is a high fever around 104 to 105, a flat erythematous rash 2 to 5 days after the fever, and some other symptoms that may or may not occur: fatigue, headaches, joint aches, muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, and lymphadenopathy. As we saw in our patient, the rash covers the body, hands, and feet, and typically spares the face. The duration of dengue fever is 1 to 2 weeks. In terms of epidemiology, around 2.5 billion people live in dengue endemic areas. 50 to 100 million people are infected every year. Of those 50 to 100 million, 500,000 people have dengue hemorrhagic fever. Dengue kills 22,000 people every year, and most of those deaths are children. In terms of some quick virology, dengue is a flavivirus, a positive single-stranded RNA virus with 4 different serotypes. This is the dengue belt, areas to which dengue is endemic, and includes Central and South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia and India. A French pharmaceutical company is currently working on a vaccine, and clinical trials are underway. And now some quick do's and don'ts. When you're talking to your patients, if they have fever, rash, muscle and joint aches, make sure to get a travel history from them because they could have dengue. And just as a quick extra overview, dengue is a flavivirus, there are 4 serotypes, and the buzzword is break bone fever. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation about dengue fever. I'm David Klimple, and you'll see us next time on The Anatomy Guy. Hi, I'm David Klimple, and this is a quick talk about dengue fever. So what we're going to do today is first give just a quick overview about dengue, then we're going to have an interview from a patient with dengue, we're going to give a clinical presentation, some epidemiology, some virology, clinical trials, and then some quick do's and don'ts. Now a quick overview about dengue. It's a flavivirus spread by mosquitoes. It's located in Indonesia and Northeast Australia, South and Central America, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and some parts of the Caribbean. The symptoms are as follows: fever, rash, headache, muscle aches, nausea, swollen lymph nodes, and vomiting. And now an interview with a patient who had dengue fever. My name is David Klimple, and this is James Coulter, and we are here to give you a little clinical correlate about dengue fever. So James, I know that you went to Haiti last year, and you picked up something along the way that you weren't expecting to pick up. You mind just kind of giving me a little bit of background about kind of why you decided to go to Haiti in the first place?
So in December 2010, I went down to Haiti with 2 of my roommates, and we were pretty much going to an orphanage, 250 orphans, with the hopes of setting up a clinic in the future.
See, these are some of the kids here. There's about 240 here right now, 100 of which came in after the earthquake.
And had you done any research before you got there about the diseases that were endemic to Haiti, or did you have any concerns about possibly picking up any diseases when you were in a third world country?
So there is, and it flooded the country pretty extensively. And at the place we were at, there were a couple of empty lots behind the orphanage that had been flooded pretty good, and there was some standing water. And this was all going on during the cholera epidemic. So one of the few things that was on our minds was malaria and also cholera. So when we were down there, we actually noticed that there was a lot more mosquitoes than what we were probably expecting to encounter.
So, we're in Haiti right now. And there's a lot of mosquitoes. And
Big bugs.
there's really big bugs here. We got...
Is that a spider on the wall or is that a bullet hole?
But we kind of just sort of blew it off, just thinking that we were covered for malaria. It's a battery of vaccinations that you're supposed to get. Pretty much includes your standard travelers vaccinations like hepatitis A, things of that nature. But and you also take malaria prophylaxis pills. So the biggest thing on our minds was probably the malaria. Was the biggest thing that we were concerned about catching. I think that we were aware that dengue was down there, but it definitely wasn't on our minds as far as something that we would catch, because we hadn't really heard much about people catching it other than what we'd seen in our microbiology textbooks.
Right. So when you finally got down there, can you tell me a little bit about what you saw, what kind of things were going through your head when you were kind of looking around the area?
Yeah, absolutely. So we went down there. Actually, it was technically the dry season, but a hurricane had come through the country, I believe a month or 2 earlier, and we had pills in case we caught cholera, and that was pretty much all that we were really worried about. So getting bit by a mosquito a couple hundred times a day wasn't really bothering us because we thought the chloroquine was going to protect us from what we thought we were going to catch.
And how were you protecting yourselves against the mosquitoes?
So it's pretty much like I mentioned earlier, we're just using chloroquine for malaria, and that was the extent of our coverage. I know that I was wearing jeans for a couple days as just to kind of cover my body up a little more from mosquitoes, but we weren't using any insect repellent.
All right. And I know that the orphanage has mosquito nets that they can provide for you while you sleep. Whether or not they work or not is another issue. Did you guys sleep under mosquito nets?
We actually did not sleep under mosquito nets, and which was something that we ended up doing later on future